She held 2 positive pregnancy tests in her hands, knowing she'd only been with one man, the billionaire who swore he could never have children, the same man who disappeared the morning after taking her virginity, leaving nothing but a cold goodbye and shattered dreams. Don't scroll past this. Your heart led you here for a reason. Beautiful souls, I'm Mr. Daniel, and this isn't just a channel, it's your family. Today's story might be exactly what your soul needed to hear. If you feel the calling, comment, "I'm ready, Mr. Daniel," and let's begin this journey together. Your one comment keeps our family's heartbeat alive. Don't just watch, become part of something greater. She gave him her virginity believing he might be her forever. But when morning came, forever lasted exactly 8 hours. The Jacksonville skyline glittered beyond floor-to-ceiling windows as rain drummed against glass, creating a cocoon of intimacy in his temporary penthouse. Candles flickered on every surface, casting warm shadows across Aaliyah Johnson's dark skin as she made the choice that would change everything. At 22, she'd saved herself for someone special, and tonight felt like destiny finally arriving at her door. "Are you absolutely sure about this?" Xavier Blackstone whispered against her neck, his hands trembling slightly as they traced the curve of her waist. At 31, the pharmaceutical billionaire had seen enough of the world to recognize something rare when he found it, but the vulnerability in his voice suggested he was just as nervous as she was. Aaliyah nodded, her fingers tangling in his dark hair as she pulled him closer. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." She'd met him 3 weeks earlier at Jacksonville Memorial Hospital, where she worked as a nursing student while caring for her grandmother who'd suffered a stroke. Xavier had been visiting the pediatric ward, his company donating new equipment to the children's wing. While other staff members whispered about his billion-dollar empire built on life-saving medications, Aaliyah had simply seen a man who looked as tired and lonely as she felt. Their first conversation had lasted 4 hours in the hospital cafeteria, coffee growing cold as they shared stories about loss and hope, about growing up poor in Jacksonville versus growing up rich and empty in Boston. Xavier told her about the car accident that had taken his parents when he was 15, leaving him with more money than love. Aaliyah shared how she'd raised herself while caring for her diabetic grandmother, working 2 jobs to pay for nursing school because helping people heal felt like the only thing that mattered. "You're different," he'd said that first night, walking her to her beat-up Honda in the hospital parking garage. "Everyone wants something from me, but you just want to know if I'm okay." Now, 3 weeks of late-night conversations and careful courtship later, she lay beneath him in his temporary Jacksonville penthouse, her nursing scrubs replaced by candlelight and trust. Xavier had flown down from Boston specifically to see her, renting the penthouse because he said hotels felt too impersonal for what he hoped would happen between them. He worshipped her body like he was memorizing every curve, every gasp, every moment of surrender. His lips traced patterns across her skin that felt like promises, his hands reverent as they explored territory no man had ever touched. When he finally joined with her, moving slowly and carefully despite the desire she could see burning in his dark eyes, Aaliyah understood why she'd waited. This wasn't just physical connection. It was souls recognizing each other in the dark. "I've never felt anything like this," Xavier breathed against her ear as they moved together, rain still drumming against the windows like nature's applause. "I didn't know it could be like this." "Neither did I," she whispered back, her body arching into his as waves of sensation built between them. "I love you, Xavier. I know it's crazy after 3 weeks, but I love you." "I love you too," he replied without hesitation, his voice rough with emotion and desire. "God, Aaliyah, I love you too." They made love twice that night, the second time slower and more exploratory, as they learned each other's bodies with the patience of people who believed they had forever. Between rounds they talked about everything, his fears about being worthy of love, her dreams of becoming a pediatric nurse, the life they might build together bridging the gap between Jacksonville and Boston. "I want to take care of you," Xavier said as she curled against his chest, her head fitting perfectly in the hollow of his shoulder. "You and your grandmother. I want to pay for your school, Get her the best medical care. Make sure you never have to worry about money again." "I don't need you to take care of me," Aaliyah replied, tracing circles on his chest with her fingertip. "I need you to love me. Everything else we can figure out together." "Together," he repeated, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. I liked the sound of that. But when morning came, the man who'd whispered promises in the dark became a stranger in expensive clothes. Aaliyah woke to find Xavier already dressed in his business suit, suitcase by the door like an escape route. The tenderness from the night before had been replaced by something cold and distant that made her stomach clench with sudden fear. "Last night was a mistake," he said without meeting her eyes, his voice as sharp as broken glass. "I'm not the man you think I am, Aaliyah. I can't give you the life you deserve." "What are you talking about?" she asked, pulling the sheet around herself as she sat up in bed. "Last night was perfect. We talked about our future, about being together." "I got caught up in the moment," Xavier replied, his jaw tight with what looked like self-hatred. "I shouldn't have let things go so far. You're young, you're innocent. You deserve someone who can give you everything you want. That's not me." Have you ever given someone your heart and body completely believing they felt the same? When trust turns to abandonment, the pain cuts deeper than any betrayal. The confusion and hurt that follows can make you question everything you thought you knew about love. "But you said you loved me," Aaliyah whispered, tears starting to spill down her cheeks. "You said we'd figure everything out together." "I said a lot of things in the heat of the moment," Xavier said, finally looking at her with eyes that seemed to see right through her. "I'm flying back to Boston this morning. Please don't try to contact me." As his Uber disappeared into Jacksonville morning traffic, Aaliyah stood at the penthouse window in his discarded dress shirt, watching her first love drive away like their night together had meant nothing. She had no idea that in 6 weeks she'd discover just how wrong he was about himself, just how much their night of passion had created, and just how impossible it was for some miracles to stay hidden. The man who claimed he couldn't give her everything had already given her more than he knew. He'd given her 2 tiny lives that would change both of their worlds forever. 2 pink lines on a pregnancy test shouldn't be possible when the father swore he was infertile, but miracles don't care about medical impossibility. 6 weeks after Xavier Blackstone disappeared from her life like smoke, Aaliyah Johnson sat on the bathroom floor of her grandmother's small Jacksonville apartment, staring at the impossible. The Walgreens pregnancy test in her trembling hands showed 2 pink lines as clear as morning sunlight, but her mind refused to process what her eyes could see. "This can't be right," she whispered to the cramped bathroom that smelled like her grandmother's arthritis cream and discount cleaning supplies. The test clattered to the tile floor as she fumbled for the second one from the box, her hands shaking so badly she could barely hold it steady. 2 minutes later, the second test confirmed what the first had revealed: pregnant. After one night with a man who'd vanished without explanation, after giving her virginity to someone who'd called their connection a mistake, she was carrying his child. "Aaliyah, baby, you been in there 20 minutes, her grandmother's voice called through the thin door. "You feeling sick again? Maybe we should get you to the doctor." 70-year-old Naomi Johnson had been asking that question for a week, as her granddaughter struggled with waves of nausea that hit without warning, exhaustion that sleep couldn't cure, and emotions that swung between fury and heartbreak with frightening speed. Aaliyah had blamed it on stress from her nursing finals and the lingering hurt from Xavier's abandonment. She'd never considered this possibility. "I'm okay, Grandma," she called back, her voice cracking as she gathered both tests and shoved them into the box. "Just give me a minute." But she wasn't okay. Nothing about this situation was okay. She was a 22-year-old nursing student who worked 2 part-time jobs to help pay for her grandmother's medications, living in a 2-bedroom apartment in one of Jacksonville's rougher neighborhoods. She had exactly $847 in her checking account and no health insurance until she graduated. Getting pregnant by anyone would have been a disaster. Getting pregnant by a billionaire who'd told her to never contact him again felt like cosmic cruelty. The next morning, she sat in the free clinic waiting room, surrounded by women whose stories were probably similar to hers. young, scared, facing impossible choices with limited resources. The nurse who called her name looked barely older than she was, her kind eyes suggesting she'd heard every version of this story before. "The blood test confirms what the home tests showed," the nurse said gently 15 minutes later. "You're approximately 6 weeks pregnant. Based on the hormone levels, I'd say everything looks normal so far." "Is there any chance the tests could be wrong?" Aaliyah asked, even though she knew the answer. Her body had been telling her for days that something fundamental had changed, even before her logical mind caught up. "The blood test is 99% accurate," the nurse replied. "Do you have any questions about your options? We can discuss resources available to you, regardless of what you decide to do." Aaliyah walked out of the clinic 30 minutes later with pamphlets about prenatal care, adoption services, and other choices she wasn't ready to consider. The Florida heat hit her like a wall as she stood on the sidewalk, trying to process how her entire life had changed in the space of one bathroom and one blood test. Her phone buzzed with a text from her study partner asking about their pharmacology exam, and the normalcy of it almost made her laugh. 2 hours ago, her biggest concern had been memorizing drug interactions. Now she was carrying the child of a man who'd treated her like a regrettable one-night stand. For 3 days, she debated whether to tell Xavier. Part of her wanted to respect his wish for no contact, to handle this situation without involving someone who'd made it clear he wanted nothing to do with her. But another part, the part that remembered how he'd looked at her with something that seemed like love, believed he deserved to know. On Thursday evening, she found the business card he'd left on the hospital donation table weeks earlier. Richardson, Associates Law Firm, was listed as his legal representation, along with a Boston phone number that probably cost more per minute than she made in an hour. "I need to speak with Mr. Blackstone," she told the receptionist who answered on the first ring. "It's regarding a personal matter that requires his immediate attention." "Mr. Blackstone doesn't take personal calls through this office," the woman replied with the kind of professional coldness that probably kept gold diggers at bay. "If you'd like to send written correspondence, I can provide you with the appropriate mailing address. Please just tell him Aaliyah Johnson from Jacksonville called," she said, trying to keep desperation out of her voice. "Tell him it's urgent." The call ended without promises, but she'd done what she could. For 2 weeks, she waited for some response. A phone call, an email, even a text message acknowledging that he'd received her message. Instead, she got something much worse. The certified letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a postal worker who looked apologetic about requiring her signature. The return address showed Richardson, Associates Law Firm, in official letterhead that made her stomach drop before she even opened the envelope. "Ms. Johnson," the letter began in language as cold as winter wind, "Mr. Blackstone has been made aware of your recent attempts to contact him. He wishes to make clear that he denies any relationship with you beyond a brief encounter that has been grossly mischaracterized. Any claims of paternity are categorically false and will be considered fraudulent attempts at extortion. Continued harassment will result in legal action. When someone abandons you and then accuses you of lying about the consequences, how do you find the strength to keep going? Have you ever had to face life-changing news completely alone, with no one believing your truth? The isolation can feel worse than the original betrayal." Aaliyah read the letter 3 times before its meaning fully sank in. Xavier hadn't just ignored her message, he'd sicked his lawyers on her like she was some kind of criminal. The man who'd whispered words of love against her skin now treated her like a threat to be neutralized. "He thinks I'm lying," she whispered to her grandmother that evening. The letter spread between them on the kitchen table like evidence in a trial. "He thinks I'm trying to trick him into giving me money." "Baby," Naomi said, reaching across to squeeze her granddaughter's hand, "some people got so much money they forget that love ain't something you can buy or fake. He probably gets women trying to trap him all the time." "But I'm not trying to trap him," Aaliyah said, tears spilling down her cheeks. "I just wanted him to know he's going to be a father." 3 weeks later, she was back at the free clinic for what she thought would be a routine checkup. Instead, The ultrasound technician grew quiet as she moved the wand across Aaliyah's growing belly, her expression shifting from routine to amazed. "Is everything okay?" Aaliyah asked, gripping the examination table as fear shot through her chest. "Everything's perfect," the technician replied with a smile that seemed to light up the room. "Actually, everything's double perfect. You're having twins." As Aaliyah stared at the ultrasound screen showing 2 tiny heartbeats flickering like stars, she knew the truth would come out eventually. Xavier Blackstone could send all the cease and desist letters he wanted, but some truths were bigger than legal threats. She just needed to get to Boston to make him listen. Because when a man who claimed he was infertile learned he was going to be the father of twins, even billionaires had to face the impossible. She took her last $300 in a Greyhound bus from Jacksonville to Boston, carrying ultrasound photos and the stubborn belief that truth matters more than pride. The Greyhound station in downtown Jacksonville smelled like disinfectant and broken dreams, but Aaliyah Johnson had never felt more determined in her life. At 14 weeks pregnant with twins, she was finally showing enough that her scrubs had to be pinned to fit properly, and the morning sickness had evolved into an all-day queasiness that made the thought of a 20-hour bus ride seem insane. But sanity was a luxury she couldn't afford. Not when Xavier Blackstone continued to pretend she didn't exist. Not when his lawyers kept sending letters threatening legal action if she didn't stop her harassment campaign. The man had no idea that carrying his children while working double shifts to pay for her grandmother's medications was harassment enough. "You sure about this, baby?" her grandmother asked for the 10th time, pressing a crumpled $20 bill into Aaliyah's palm as they stood by the bus that would take her away from everything familiar. "That's a long way to go for a man who don't want to see you." "He doesn't get to decide whether his children exist," Aaliyah replied, adjusting the backpack that held everything she could afford to take. Ultrasound photos, medical records, the hotel confirmation for one night at a Boston budget motel, and exactly $47 in emergency cash after buying the bus ticket. "I'm not asking him to marry me or take care of me. I just need him to know the truth." The bus trip was everything she'd expected, and worse. 20 hours of crying babies, snoring passengers, and rest stops at gas stations that looked like scenes from horror movies. But every mile that carried her further from Jacksonville brought her closer to answers that had been months in the making. As Virginia countryside gave way to New York traffic and finally Massachusetts highways, Aaliyah felt something she hadn't experienced since that devastating morning in Xavier's penthouse: hope. Boston's financial district towered over her like glass and steel giants as she stepped off the bus at South Station, her legs wobbling from sitting too long and her stomach churning from pregnancy hormones mixed with nervous energy. The building that housed Blackstone Pharmaceuticals represented everything she'd never have: power, influence, enough money to solve problems instead of being crushed by them. But somewhere on the 40th floor of that gleaming tower, a man who'd made love to her like she was precious was about to learn that some connections can't be severed by lawyers or distance. The security guard in the lobby looked at her rumpled clothes and obviously pregnant state with the kind of professional suspicion that probably kept unwanted visitors away from important executives. "Do you have an appointment, miss?" "I need to speak with Xavier Blackstone," she said, trying to project confidence she didn't feel. "It's regarding a family matter that requires his immediate attention." "Mr. Blackstone doesn't see anyone without scheduled appointments," the guard replied, his tone polite but firm. "You'll need to contact his office through proper channels." "I've tried proper channels for months," Aaliyah said, her voice rising slightly as frustration overrode embarrassment. "This is urgent. It concerns his children." The guard's expression shifted from suspicion to something approaching pity. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to leave. If you don't go voluntarily, I'll need to call security." Aaliyah was about to argue when the elevator doors opened and a man in an expensive suit stepped out, talking rapidly into his phone. She recognized Xavier's voice before her eyes confirmed what her heart already knew. Even from across the lobby, even after months of silence, her body responded to his presence like a compass finding north. "The test results haven't changed, Dr. Martinez. Xavier was saying as he walked toward the building exit, completely unaware of her presence. "I'm still completely infertile. The accident damaged everything beyond repair. It's impossible for me to father children, so we need to focus on other treatment options for the hormone imbalance." The words hit Aaliyah like a physical blow, stopping her forward movement as understanding crashed over her. Xavier wasn't ignoring her claims because he thought she was lying for money. He was denying them because he genuinely believed they were medically impossible. How far would you travel to make someone acknowledge the truth? Sometimes the hardest conversations are the ones that change everything, the ones that force someone to confront everything they thought they knew about themselves. What would you have done in her situation? Her hand went instinctively to her growing belly where 2 heartbeats proved him wrong. If Xavier truly believed he was infertile, then her pregnancy wasn't just unexpected, it was miraculous. But miracles, she was learning, were often harder to accept than tragedies. "Mr. Blackstone," she called across the lobby, her voice carrying clearly in the marble space. Xavier stopped mid-sentence, his phone falling away from his ear as he turned toward the sound. When his eyes found hers across 30 feet of expensive flooring, his face went through a series of expressions: surprise, recognition, something that might have been longing, and finally a cold mask that she remembered from their last morning together. "Security," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving her face. "Please escort this woman from the building." But Aaliyah was already moving, her months of anger and hurt and desperate love propelling her across the lobby before anyone could stop her. She had ultrasound photos in her backpack and truth in her heart, and for the first time since that devastating morning in Jacksonville, she was close enough to make him listen. "I'm pregnant, Xavier," she said when she was close enough to see the gold flecks in his dark eyes, close enough to remember how those eyes had looked at her with worship instead of dismissal. "I'm carrying your babies, twins, and before you call me a liar or a gold digger or whatever your lawyers told you to think, maybe you should ask yourself why a poor nursing student would travel 1,000 miles just to tell you something that could be disproved with a simple test." The lobby had gone completely silent, other visitors and employees stopping to watch the drama unfold between the billionaire and the young black woman who stood before him with quiet dignity despite her obvious exhaustion. Xavier's face had gone pale, his eyes dropping to her rounded belly before snapping back to her face. If he couldn't have children, then who was the father of her twins? The question hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything he thought he knew about himself, about that night in Jacksonville, about the impossibility of miracles happening to people who'd given up on hope. She walked into his Boston office carrying proof of the impossible and watched a billionaire's world crumble with 2 simple words: "I'm pregnant." Xavier's corner office overlooked Boston Harbor, but he only had eyes for the young woman from Jacksonville holding ultrasound photos like evidence in a trial. The same woman whose soft moans had echoed through his penthouse now stood before him with quiet strength that made his accusations sound hollow even before he spoke them. "This is impossible," he said, sinking into his leather chair as if the weight of her presence had knocked the strength from his legs. "I've been to every fertility specialist on the East Coast. The car accident when I was 18 damaged everything beyond repair. I cannot father children, Aaliyah. It's medically impossible." "Tell that to them," she replied, placing the ultrasound photos on his mahogany desk with careful precision. The black and white images showed 2 tiny forms, clearly defined despite their early stage, heartbeats frozen in time, but unmistakably real. Baby A and Baby B, due in 6 months, conceived approximately 14 weeks ago during what you called a mistake. Xavier stared at the photos like they might disappear if he looked hard enough, his hands trembling as he reached for them. For a moment his face showed something approaching wonder, the expression of a man seeing proof of a miracle he'd never dared hope for. But then reality crashed back, and his features hardened into the cold mask she remembered from their goodbye. "These could be anyone's children," he said, pushing the photos back toward her like they might contaminate him. You could have been with someone else before or after our night together. Hell, you could have gotten pregnant months earlier and just waited until now to spring this trap." The accusation hit Aaliyah like a slap, stealing her breath and bringing tears she'd promised herself she wouldn't shed in front of him. "You were my first, Xavier. My only. You know that. You felt it that night. You saw the proof of it." "People lie," he replied, his voice as sharp as broken glass. "Especially when there's money involved. How much do you want? A few million to disappear? Child support payments that would set you up for life? Just name your price." When someone you trusted completely calls you a liar about something life-changing, how do you respond? Is it possible to forgive someone who refuses to believe the truth about your own body, who turns love into a transaction and miracles into schemes? "I don't want your money," Aaliyah said, standing from the chair across from his desk with dignity that belied her rumpled clothes and exhausted state. "I wanted you to know that the night you called a mistake created two beautiful children who will grow up knowing their father chose pride over love." "DNA test," Xavier said suddenly, his voice cutting through her prepared goodbye. "If you're so sure these are my children, prove it. Take a paternity test and let science settle this once and for all." "Fine," Aaliyah replied without hesitation. "But when those results prove I'm telling the truth, I want you to remember this moment. I want you to remember that you looked at the mother of your children and called her a liar and a gold digger instead of asking yourself how something impossible might actually be possible." The genetic testing took place that afternoon at Mass General, the same hospital where Xavier had received the devastating news about his infertility years earlier. Aaliyah submitted to blood draws and medical questions with the patience of someone who'd spent months having her truth questioned, while Xavier paced the waiting room like a caged animal. "Results will be available in 3 to 5 business days," the lab technician informed them with professional neutrality. "We'll call both parties with the findings." Outside the hospital, they stood on the sidewalk like strangers instead of two people who'd created life together, the gulf between them wider than the physical distance separating their bodies. "Where are you staying?" Xavier asked, the first personal question he'd asked since she'd appeared in his lobby. "Budget motel near the bus station," Aaliyah replied, shifting her backpack to ease the pressure on her shoulders. "I fly back to Jacksonville tomorrow morning." "You took a bus here?" Xavier's voice carried surprise and something that might have been guilt. "From Florida? While pregnant?" "It's what I could afford," she said simply. "Not all of us have private jets for when we need to have difficult conversations." For a moment, his mask slipped, and she saw the man who'd held her through the night, who'd whispered promises against her skin and made her believe in forever. But then his walls went back up, and he was once again the billionaire who treated her like a threat to be managed. "The DNA results will prove you're mistaken," he said, but his voice carried less certainty than his words suggested. "When they do, I expect you to leave me alone permanently." "And when they prove I'm telling the truth?" Aaliyah asked, her hand resting protectively on her growing belly. "What then, Xavier? Do you plan to spend the next 18 years pretending your children don't exist?" He didn't answer, couldn't answer, because they both knew the test results would change everything. As Aaliyah walked away toward the subway station that would take her back to her budget motel, Xavier stood on the sidewalk watching her go, his hand unconsciously moving to his chest where his heart was breaking all over again. 3 days later, the call came while Aaliyah was working her shift at the Jacksonville hospital, cleaning rooms and trying not to think about what was happening in a lab hundreds of miles away. Xavier's name on her caller ID made her hands shake as she stepped into an empty supply closet to take the call. "The results are in," he said without preamble, his voice completely flat. 99.9% probability that I'm the biological father." The silence stretched between them across state lines, filled with months of denial and hurt and the weight of impossible truth finally acknowledged. "I'm sorry," he said finally, the words carrying more weight than any legal document or financial settlement ever could. "I'm sorry I didn't believe you. I'm sorry I called you names and treated you like you were lying. I'm sorry I wasted months we could have spent figuring this out together. As security escorted her from his building weeks earlier, Aaliyah had turned back one last time. I don't want your money, Xavier. I just wanted you to know your children exist. Now, with DNA proof spreading between them like a bridge over their broken trust, she realized getting him to acknowledge their existence was only the beginning. The real challenge would be getting him to accept that sometimes impossible things happen to people brave enough to believe in miracles. The paternity test results didn't just prove who the father was, they revealed a medical miracle that happened once in 10 million cases. Dr. Sarah Martinez had been a genetic counselor at Mass General for 15 years, but she'd never had to explain results quite like these. Xavier Blackstone sat across from her desk, looking like a man who'd had his entire worldview shattered, while the medical file in front of her contained proof of something that should have been impossible, according to every test he'd ever taken. The paternity results are conclusive, Dr. Martinez began, her voice gentle but clear. You are definitely the biological father of Ms. Johnson's twins, but more importantly, Mr. Blackstone, we need to discuss how this pregnancy was even possible, given your medical history. Aaliyah had flown back to Boston that morning, leaving her grandmother and her job and her entire life, because Xavier had asked her to be present for this conversation. She sat beside him in the genetics office, still maintaining careful distance, despite the DNA confirmation that had vindicated everything she'd been saying for months. I don't understand, Xavier said, his hands gripping the chair arms like he was afraid he might fall. Every doctor I've seen since the accident has confirmed the same thing: complete infertility, zero sperm production. I was told it was permanent and irreversible. Your accident did cause significant damage, Dr. Martinez agreed, pulling up test results on her computer screen. But what you and Ms. Johnson created together appears to be what we call a medical miracle. Her unique blood type and genetic markers somehow activated dormant fertility that we didn't even know you possessed. The genetic counselor's office felt sterile and clinical, but the words she spoke were anything but cold. Charts and graphs covered the walls, showing the intricate dance of DNA that created human life, but none of them explained how two people from completely different worlds had managed to create something scientifically extraordinary. I'm O-negative blood type, Aaliyah said quietly, speaking for the first time since they'd sat down. The nurse at my clinic mentioned it was rare, but she didn't say anything about it affecting fertility. O-negative blood in combination with your specific genetic markers creates what we call a catalytic environment, Dr. Martinez explained. In extremely rare cases, we're talking about 1 in 10 million, this combination can temporarily activate dormant reproductive cells in men with certain types of fertility damage. It's like your body provided the missing piece his needed to function. Xavier stared at the ultrasound photos scattered across the doctor's desk, the black and white images taking on new meaning now that science had confirmed what his heart had refused to believe. These weren't just any babies, they were medical miracles, proof that sometimes love could literally create life where none should have been possible. So you're saying that Aaliyah's genetics somehow fixed me? Xavier asked, his voice carrying wonder and disbelief in equal measure. Not permanently, Dr. Martinez clarified. This was likely a one-time event triggered by the specific chemical and hormonal interaction between your bodies during conception. Think of it as the perfect storm of genetic compatibility creating a brief window of possibility. The room fell silent as they processed the magnitude of what they were hearing. Not only was Xavier going to be a father, but these children represented a biological phenomenon so rare that medical journals would probably want to study them. Their night of passion hadn't just created babies, it had defied medical science. Realization that their intimate connection created something scientifically extraordinary hung in the air between them, changing everything about how they understood not just the pregnancy, but the depth of their compatibility on levels they'd never even known existed. What does this mean for the babies? Aaliyah asked, her hand moving protectively to her belly. Are they healthy? Normal? Completely healthy and developing perfectly, Dr. Martinez assured her with a smile. The miraculous nature of their conception doesn't affect their development in any way. You're carrying two normal, healthy babies who just happen to exist because their parents' genetics aligned in an extraordinary way. After the appointment, they sat in Xavier's car in the hospital parking garage, both struggling to process information that changed everything they thought they knew about themselves and each other. The man who'd spent years believing he was broken had just learned he was capable of creating miracles, while the woman he'd accused of lying had been vindicated by science itself. "I owe you more than an apology," Xavier said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "I owe you my life because these children, they're proof that impossible things can happen when the right people find each other." "I don't want your gratitude," Aaliyah replied, though her voice held less anger than it had weeks earlier. "I want to know what happens now. These babies are coming whether we figure out how to be in each other's lives or not. Have you ever been right about something when everyone thought you were lying? When the truth finally comes out, is vindication enough to heal the hurt? Sometimes being proven right feels less satisfying than you imagined when you're finally holding the evidence everyone refused to believe." "I want to be involved," Xavier said, turning to face her fully for the first time since she'd arrived in Boston. "I want to be their father, not just biologically, but actually. I want to take care of you during the pregnancy, make sure you have everything you need, be there when they're born." "And after they're born?" Aaliyah asked. "Do you want to be their father then too, or just until the novelty wears off?" The question hung between them like a challenge, because they both knew that good intentions in emotional moments didn't always translate to sustained commitment. Xavier had already proven he could disappear when things got complicated. What guarantee did she have that fatherhood wouldn't eventually feel like another mistake he needed to escape? "I want to try," he said simply. "I know I messed up everything between us, and I know trust isn't something I can buy or demand. But these babies are miracles, Aaliyah. We're miracles. Maybe that means we're supposed to figure out how to make this work." 2 weeks later, Xavier sat in his Boston penthouse, a different one from where they'd first made love, but just as empty despite its luxury, staring at ultrasound photos of his miracle children and finally understanding what he'd thrown away. But when he called Aaliyah's number to discuss their future, a stranger answered with words that stopped his heart. "She moved to Atlanta last week," the voice said. "Took a job at a children's hospital there, said she was done with people who don't believe in miracles unless science proves them first." As Xavier held his phone in the silence of his empty penthouse, he realized that proving paternity had been the easy part. The real challenge would be proving that a man who'd spent his life running from love was finally ready to stay and fight for it, even if it meant following a miracle all the way to Georgia. Chapter 6. Starting over in Atlanta. She rebuilt her life in Atlanta, Georgia, carrying twins and the weight of doing everything alone, but some miracles refused to stay hidden. The little 5 Points neighborhood of Atlanta embraced Aaliyah with its eclectic mix of students and artists, vintage record stores, and coffee shops that stayed open past midnight. Her studio apartment above Rosario's used books wasn't much, 400 square feet that she could barely afford even with her transfer scholarship to Emory University's nursing program. But the 70-year-old Cuban woman who owned the bookstore treated her like family. "Mija, you eat too little," Miss Rosa would say every morning, appearing at Aaliyah's door with Cuban coffee and homemade bread. "Those babies need more than your stubborn pride to grow strong." At 24 weeks pregnant, Aaliyah's belly had grown round enough that strangers offered their seats on the MARTA train. But she still worked 20 hours a week at a pediatric clinic to supplement her scholarship money. Every dollar mattered when you were building a life from nothing, when every ultrasound appointment reminded you that twins meant double everything, double expenses, double worry, double love for children whose father had walked away twice. "You sure you don't want to call him?" asked Keisha, her study partner from nursing school, as they reviewed notes for their pediatric care exam. They sat in the small courtyard behind the bookstore, surrounded by the scent of jasmine and the sound of street musicians warming up for their evening sets. "I mean, the man is loaded. These babies are his responsibility too." "He made his choice," Aaliyah replied, her hand resting on her belly where the twins seemed to be having a dance party. "I'm not going to beg someone to care about their own children." The truth was more complicated than pride, though she wouldn't admit it to anyone. Late at night, when the babies were most active and sleep wouldn't come, she found herself missing more than Xavier's financial support. She missed the way he'd held her that night in Jacksonville, the gentleness in his hands, the vulnerability in his voice when he'd whispered that he loved her. The man who'd made love to her like she was precious had existed, even if he'd disappeared the next morning, but missing someone and trusting them were two different things. Aaliyah had learned that lesson the hard way. Her new life in Atlanta was smaller than her dreams, but bigger than her fears. The nursing program at Emory was challenging but rewarding, her professors encouraging her to specialize in neonatal intensive care. "You have natural instincts with fragile babies," Professor Williams had told her after observing her clinical rotation. "Have you considered that your own pregnancy might be preparing you for this calling?" The pediatric clinic where she worked part-time had become a second home, the staff treating her like their mascot as her pregnancy progressed. Dr. Patel, the attending physician, had insisted on personally monitoring her prenatal care after learning she was carrying twins without family support. "Twin pregnancies require extra attention," he'd explained during her 20-week appointment. "Especially when you're working and studying full-time. Promise me you'll slow down if your body tells you to." "I can't afford to slow down," Aaliyah had replied honestly. "These babies are depending on me to finish school and build a career that can support them." When someone has hurt you deeply, is it possible to start fresh somewhere new? How do you rebuild trust in yourself after being made to feel like a liar? The questions followed her through her daily routine in Atlanta, through late-night study sessions and early morning shifts at the clinic. Her small apartment had become a sanctuary decorated with ultrasound photos and baby clothes from the church thrift store. She'd painted one wall with scenes from children's books, Goodnight Moon and Where the Wild Things Are, creating a nursery corner that would welcome two babies who'd never know their father chose fear over love. The loneliness hit hardest in the evenings, when Atlanta's heat finally broke and she could sit on her tiny balcony overlooking the eclectic neighborhood. College students walked by holding hands, young families pushed strollers to the park, couples shared dinner at sidewalk cafes. She was surrounded by connection while feeling completely alone, carrying two lives that would forever link her to a man who'd twice chosen distance over difficult conversations. "You're stronger than you know," Miss Rosa would tell her during their evening chats. "My grandmother used to say that God gives the hardest battles to his strongest soldiers. Maybe these babies chose you because they knew you could handle anything." At 30 weeks pregnant, climbing the stairs to her apartment left her breathless, her body working overtime to support two rapidly growing babies. The doctor had warned her about the increased risks of twin pregnancy, preterm labor, complications that could arise without warning. But Aaliyah had faced worse odds and survived. She'd raised herself while caring for a diabetic grandmother, worked her way through nursing school, survived heartbreak and humiliation and financial crisis. She could handle whatever came next. She never noticed the black Tesla that had been parked across the street for 3 days, or the man inside who watched her every move with the desperate attention of someone learning a routine he'd never been invited to share. Xavier Blackstone had hired private investigators to find her, but now that he'd located the woman carrying his miracle children, he couldn't find the courage to cross the street and face the consequences of everything he'd thrown away. From his car, he watched her struggle up the stairs with grocery bags, watched her pause to catch her breath, watched her place protective hands on her belly where his children grew without him. Each observation was another knife to his conscience, proof that while he'd been nursing his wounded pride in Boston, she'd been building a life strong enough for 3. The woman he'd abandoned was thriving without him, and that terrified him more than any business failure ever could. Hurricane Helen tore through Georgia with 120 mile-before winds, But the real storm hit when her water broke 6 weeks early with no way to get to the hospital. Wind howled through Atlanta like a freight train while rain hammered against Aaliyah's windows with the fury of nature unleashed. At 34 weeks pregnant, she'd spent the morning helping Miss Rosa secure the bookstore, boarding up windows and moving rare books to higher shelves in case of flooding. Now, as Hurricane Helen made landfall with devastating force, she was alone in her apartment watching tree branches whip past her window like angry spirits. The power had gone out 2 hours earlier, leaving her with battery-powered radio updates that grew more ominous by the hour. All residents are advised to shelter in place, the emergency broadcast repeated. Emergency services are suspended until wind speeds drop below 50 miles per hour. Do not attempt to travel. Aaliyah sat on her bed, trying to focus on the nursing textbook in her lap by candlelight, when the first contraction hit. Sharp pain radiated from her lower back around to her belly, stealing her breath and making her drop the book. She checked her watch, 8:47 p.m., and tried to convince herself it was just Braxton Hicks, the practice contractions that had been bothering her for weeks. But 15 minutes later, another contraction gripped her with unmistakable intensity, then another and another. "No, no, no," she whispered to the empty apartment, her hands moving to her belly, where the twins seemed to be responding to their mother's stress with increased movement. "You're not coming yet. It's too early. We need 6 more weeks." She fumbled for her phone, grateful that cell towers were still functioning despite the storm. The number for her obstetrician went straight to voicemail. Dr. Patel was probably dealing with his own family's hurricane preparations. She tried the hospital next, waiting through an agonizing hold message while another contraction built and peaked. "Emory University Hospital, how can I help you?" The voice sounded harried, overwhelmed. "I'm 34 weeks pregnant with twins and having contractions every 10 minutes, Aaliyah said, trying to keep panic out of her voice. "I need to get to the labor and delivery unit." "Ma'am, all roads to the hospital are currently impassable," the operator replied with professional sympathy. "We have trees down across every major intersection, and emergency vehicles can't get through. Can you call someone to drive you?" Aaliyah looked around her empty apartment, reality crashing over her like the storm outside. Miss Rosa was elderly and didn't drive. Her study group friends lived across town in areas that were probably just as blocked. She had no family in Atlanta, no support system beyond the small community she'd built through work and school. "There's no one," she admitted, her voice breaking. "I'm alone." When everything goes wrong at once, who would you want by your side? Sometimes crisis reveals who people really are beneath their fears, who shows up when the stakes are highest and the excuses run out. Another contraction hit, stronger than the last, forcing her to breathe through the pain while rain lashed against her windows. Between contractions, she called 911, hoping for options she hadn't considered. "Emergency services are suspended due to hurricane conditions," the dispatcher confirmed what she already knew. "We cannot send an ambulance until the storm passes. Do you have someone who can assist you?" "I'm having twins," Aaliyah said, desperation bleeding through her carefully maintained composure. "They're coming too early. I need help." "Ma'am, I'm going to connect you with our emergency medical advisor. Stay on the line and try to remain calm." But remaining calm was impossible when contractions were coming every 8 minutes and she could hear trees crashing in the courtyard below. The babies weren't waiting for clear weather or emergency services or anyone else to be ready for their arrival. She was still on hold with emergency services when pounding echoed through her apartment, someone knocking on her door with urgent persistence. Through the storm's chaos and her own panic, she heard a familiar voice calling out words that stopped her heart. "Aaliyah, it's Xavier. I'm here to get you to the hospital." For a moment she thought the stress was making her hallucinate. Xavier was in Boston, probably in some climate-controlled boardroom making deals while she labored alone in a hurricane. But the pounding continued, and his voice carried clearly over the wind. "Please open the door. I know you probably hate me, but I'm not leaving you to go through this alone." Another contraction hit as she made her way to the door, forcing her to lean against the wall and breathe through pain that seemed to be intensifying by the minute. When she opened the door, Xavier stood in her hallway, soaked from rain, his expensive clothes ruined and his face showing raw fear she'd never seen before. "What are you doing here?" she gasped between contractions. "I've been in Atlanta for 3 days, trying to work up the courage to talk to you," he said, stepping inside and immediately assessing her condition with eyes that missed nothing. "When I heard about the hurricane, I couldn't leave. I couldn't risk something happening to you and the babies while I was hiding like a coward." She didn't know whether to cry from relief or rage, but the twins were coming whether she forgave him or not. Another contraction gripped her, stronger than any before, and Xavier was beside her instantly, supporting her weight and breathing with her like he'd attended every childbirth class she'd taken alone. "How far apart are the contractions?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear in his eyes. "Every 5 minutes now," she admitted, leaning into his strength despite every reason not to trust him. "The roads are blocked. We can't get to the hospital." "Yes, we can," Xavier said with the confidence of someone accustomed to making impossible things happen. "I have a Range Rover that can handle floodwater, and I know every back road between here and Emory. We're getting you to that hospital, Aaliyah. I promise." As another contraction ripped through her body, she realized that sometimes the person who shows up in your darkest hour isn't the one you expected. It's the one who finally understands what they stand to lose. She gave birth to twins during a hurricane with the man who'd abandoned her holding her hand, proving that some moments transcend every hurt that came before. The delivery room at Emory University Hospital felt like the eye of the storm. Chaos outside, but inside, controlled urgency as medical staff prepared for the premature arrival of miracle twins. Aaliyah gripped Xavier's hand through another contraction, her nails digging into his palm as pain washed over her in waves that seemed to match the hurricane winds battering the building. "Contractions are 2 minutes apart," announced Dr. Patel, who'd arrived at the hospital despite the storm when he heard one of his favorite patients was in labor. "These babies are coming tonight whether we're ready or not." Xavier hadn't left her side since carrying her through knee-deep floodwater to reach his Range Rover, then driving through Atlanta's abandoned streets while she labored in the passenger seat. Now he stood beside her hospital bed wearing scrubs over his soaked clothes, his expensive watch forgotten as he focused entirely on breathing with her through each contraction. "You're doing amazing," he whispered against her forehead, his voice rough with emotion she'd never heard before. "You're the strongest person I know." "Don't," she gasped between contractions, even as her body instinctively leaned into his support. "Don't say things you don't mean just because I'm having your babies." "I mean every word," Xavier replied, his free hand stroking her hair with reverent gentleness. "I've meant every word since that night in Jacksonville. I was just too scared to fight for what I felt." Dr. Patel's voice cut through their conversation with professional urgency. "Aaliyah, I need you to push with the next contraction. Baby A is crowning." The next hour passed in a blur of pain and effort and medical instructions, Xavier's voice providing steady encouragement while machines monitored 2 heartbeats that had somehow defied medical impossibility. When their son finally emerged, small but breathing, perfect despite arriving 6 weeks early, the delivery room filled with the sound of his indignant cries. "He's beautiful," Xavier breathed, tears streaming down his face as Dr. Patel placed the baby on Aaliyah's chest for skin-to-skin contact. "Look at him. He's perfect." Xavier Matthew Blackstone weighed 4 pounds, 2 ounces, tiny but fierce, with his father's dark hair and his mother's determined chin. As Aaliyah held him against her chest, feeling his rapid heartbeat against her own, she understood why people called childbirth miraculous. This small person had grown inside her for months, had survived her stress and heartbreak and lonely nights, and now he was here, real and breathing and utterly dependent on parents who barely knew how to be in the same room together. "One down, 1 to go," Dr. Patel announced with gentle humor. "Your daughter seems a bit more reluctant to join the party." Their daughter, it turned out, was breech, feet first instead of head down, requiring careful maneuvering that had everyone in the delivery room holding their breath. When Aaliyah Rose Johnson finally arrived 20 minutes after her brother, she was even smaller at 3 pounds, 15 ounces, but her lungs worked perfectly as she announced her displeasure at the bright lights and cold air. When Xavier placed their son in Aaliyah's arms and cradled their daughter against his chest, skin-to-skin contact that meant everything and nothing all at once, the room fell silent except for the soft sounds of newborn breathing. Outside, Hurricane Helen continued her assault on Georgia, but inside this small space, 2 perfect babies had entered the world, while their parents wept with joy, exhaustion, and the weight of everything that had brought them to this moment. "They're perfect," Xavier whispered, his voice breaking as he looked down at the daughter who'd wrapped tiny fingers around his thumb, just like their mother. "Have you ever experienced a moment so powerful it changed everything you thought you knew about forgiveness? When someone shows up in your darkest hour, does it erase the pain they caused, or does it just complicate everything you thought you'd figured out?" "They need to go to the NICU," Dr. Patel explained gently. "Just as a precaution because they're premature. Their breathing and heart rates are excellent, but we want to monitor them closely for the first few days." As medical staff prepared to transport the twins to the neonatal intensive care unit, Aaliyah found herself studying Xavier's face as he looked at their children. The man who'd claimed he could never have kids now held tangible proof that miracles existed, that sometimes impossible things happened to people brave enough to believe in them. "I know I don't deserve a second chance with you," Xavier said as they watched their babies being wheeled toward the NICU, tiny figures dwarfed by medical equipment but breathing steadily on their own. "I know I abandoned you when you needed me most, and I know trust isn't something I can earn back with grand gestures or expensive gifts." "Then why are you here?" Aaliyah asked, exhaustion making her more honest than she might have been under normal circumstances. "Because these children deserve a father who shows up every day," Xavier replied, his voice carrying a conviction she'd never heard from him before. "Because you deserved better than what I gave you, and because I want to spend the rest of my life proving that the man who walked away doesn't exist anymore." Her response would determine if miracles could extend beyond medicine to matters of the heart, if 2 people who'd created life together could find a way to build something worth preserving from the wreckage of everything they'd lost. "Stay tonight," she said finally, the words carrying weight beyond their simple meaning. "Stay and help me figure out how to take care of them. Everything else we can work out later." As Xavier settled into the chair beside her hospital bed, both of them exhausted, but unable to sleep while their miracle babies fought their first battle in the NICU down the hall, Aaliyah realized that some moments were too big for past hurts, too important for pride or fear, or any of the walls they'd built to protect themselves. Tonight, they were just 2 parents watching over the impossible children who'd brought them back together in the middle of a storm. Sharing custody of miracle twins with the man who broke your heart teaches you that love and trust are 2 very different things. Xavier's Atlanta penthouse had been transformed into a baby paradise that would have been ridiculous if it wasn't so necessary. The man who'd once lived in sterile luxury now had cribs, changing tables, and toys scattered across marble floors, his $1,000 shirts perpetually decorated with spit-up stains that he wore like badges of honor. At 3 months old, Xavier Jr. and Aaliyah Rose had their father wrapped around their tiny fingers in ways that billion-dollar deals had never managed. "They're getting stronger every day," Dr. Patel had announced during their latest checkup, watching Xavier Jr. grab for the stethoscope while his sister studied the ceiling with serious dark eyes. "No developmental delays, excellent weight gain. These babies are beating every premature birth statistic we have." Aaliyah watched Xavier change their son's diaper with the competence of someone who'd thrown himself into learning every aspect of baby care, his large hands gentle as he cleaned and powdered and fastened tiny clothes. The same hands that had once signed contracts worth billions now celebrated getting a onesie snapped correctly on the first try. "He's going to be a heartbreaker," Xavier murmured, making silly faces that earned him a toothless grin from his son. "Look at that smile. He knows exactly how cute he is." "Just like his father," Aaliyah replied without thinking, then immediately regretted the comment when Xavier's eyes found hers across the nursery. 3 months of co-parenting had created a comfortable routine between them, but moments like these, when her guard dropped and something resembling their old connection sparked, reminded her why trusting him felt so dangerous. They'd established a schedule that worked around Aaliyah's final semester of nursing school and Xavier's gradual relocation of his business operations from Boston to Atlanta. He had the twins 3 nights a week at his penthouse, she had them 4 nights at her apartment, and they shared weekend responsibilities based on whoever had the lighter workload. On paper, it looked like modern co-parenting at its finest. In reality, it was emotional warfare disguised as civility. "I hired a contractor to baby-proof the penthouse," Xavier said as he lifted their daughter from her bouncy seat, her serious expression melting into pure joy when she saw his face. "Safety gates, cabinet locks, outlet covers, the works. I know they won't be crawling for months, but I want everything ready." When someone has hurt you but proves they're a good parent, how do you separate those feelings? Is it possible to co-parent successfully with someone you don't trust romantically? The questions followed Aaliyah through every interaction, every time she watched Xavier's face light up when the twins reached for him. "That's good," she replied, focusing on packing the diaper bag for the handoff back to her apartment. "They'll be mobile sooner than we think." The practical conversations were easy, feeding schedules, doctor appointments, developmental milestones they celebrated separately, but shared through text messages filled with photos and videos. It was the quiet moments that tested her resolve, like now, when Xavier held their daughter against his chest and hummed the same lullaby she'd heard him sing during late-night feedings at the hospital. "Aaliyah," he said softly, his voice carrying the weight of things they never discussed, "can I ask you something? If it's about the babies, yes. If it's about anything else, probably not." "It's about us," Xavier continued despite her warning. "About what happens when they're old enough to ask why their parents don't live together. What do we tell them?" The question she'd been avoiding hung between them like a challenge to every careful boundary she'd constructed. Their children would grow up in 2 homes, shuttling between parents who could discuss diaper rash and sleep schedules, but couldn't address the elephant in every room. The fact that they'd created these miracle babies during one night of love that had turned into months of hurt. "We tell them the truth," Aaliyah said finally, "that we loved each other once, but we couldn't make it work. That sometimes good people make bad choices, but that doesn't mean they're bad parents." "What if I told you I'm in therapy?" Xavier asked suddenly, the words tumbling out like a confession he'd been holding back. "What if I told you I've been seeing Dr. Martinez twice a week since the babies were born, trying to understand why I sabotage everything good in my life?" The admission stopped her mid-motion as she folded baby clothes, her hands stilling as she processed what he'd said. In all their co-parenting conversations, Xavier had never mentioned personal growth or self-reflection. He'd focused entirely on being the best father possible, as if compartmentalizing his relationship with the twins from his relationship with her. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I want you to know that I'm not the same man who walked away from you twice," Xavier replied, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I'm not asking for forgiveness or another chance. I'm just asking you to know that I'm working to become someone worthy of the family we created." During a late-night feeding, when both babies were fussy and teething, Xavier arrived at her apartment without being asked, carrying coffee and extra diapers, and the patient energy of someone who'd learned that parenting meant showing up regardless of convenience. As they worked together to comfort their children, Aaliyah walking the hardwood floors with their daughter while Xavier bounced their son against his shoulder, she caught herself thinking dangerous thoughts. "This is what I thought we'd have. This is what I dreamed about during those lonely months when I carried them alone." "Thank you," she said when both babies finally settled into sleep, her voice barely above a whisper in the darkened living room. "For what?" Xavier asked, still holding their son, even though he was clearly asleep. "For showing up," Aaliyah replied honestly. "For not making me do this alone anymore." The dangerous thought scared her more than any vulnerability she'd felt before, because it suggested that maybe, just maybe, the man who'd broken her heart might actually be capable of putting it back together. But trust, she'd learned, was like a premature baby. It required careful monitoring, constant attention, and the faith that something fragile could grow strong enough to survive in the world. Whether Xavier Blackstone deserved that kind of faith remained the question that would determine if their family could become more than just shared custody and coordinated schedules. He didn't just ask for forgiveness. He went to therapy, learned why he sabotaged love, and slowly became the man she'd hoped he could be all along. The park near Emory University had become their neutral meeting ground, a place where two parents could push swings while having the hardest conversations of their lives. Spring bloomed around them as they worked through winter's worth of hurt, one honest word at a time. At 6 months old, Xavier Jr. and Aaliyah Rose were fascinated by the movement of tree branches overhead, their happy babbling providing soundtrack to discussions that would determine their family's future. "Dr. Martinez says I have what she calls abandonment anxiety," Xavier said, pushing his daughter's swing with gentle rhythm while Aaliyah did the same for their son. "Basically, I'm so terrified of being left that I leave first. It's a pattern I've had since my parents died." This was their third park therapy session, as Aaliyah had started calling these conversations where Xavier shared insights from his twice-weekly appointments with the same genetic counselor who'd explained their medical miracle. What had started as professional relationship had evolved into something deeper when Dr. Martinez realized that Xavier's emotional walls were as much a barrier to his children's well-being as any physical health concern. "That makes sense," Aaliyah replied, surprised by her own willingness to engage with his psychological revelations. "But understanding why you hurt people doesn't undo the damage." "I know," Xavier said, his voice carrying the weight of months spent examining his worst impulses. "Dr. Martinez keeps reminding me that insight without change is just expensive self-awareness. That's why I'm also seeing Dr. Williams for behavioral therapy twice a week." When someone proves they're working to change their harmful patterns, how long does it take to believe the change is real? What does genuine accountability look like versus just saying, "sorry"? Aaliyah found herself studying Xavier's face as he spoke, looking for signs of performance versus genuine transformation. "What kind of behavioral therapy?" she asked, genuinely curious despite her protective instincts. "Learning to sit with uncomfortable emotions instead of running," Xavier explained, lifting their daughter from her swing when she started fussing. "Learning to communicate feelings instead of making assumptions. Learning that vulnerability isn't weakness. It's actually the only way to build real intimacy." The word intimacy hung in the air between them, loaded with memory and possibility, and all the reasons Aaliyah had built walls around her heart. Watching Xavier comfort their daughter with practiced ease, she saw glimpses of the man she'd fallen for that night in Jacksonville, tender, present, completely focused on someone else's needs. "I'm in therapy too," she admitted, the confession surprising them both. "Started after the babies were born. Turns out carrying miracle twins while feeling abandoned triggers some serious trust issues." Xavier's expression shifted to something approaching hope mixed with concern. "What are you learning?" "That I have a pattern of choosing unavailable men, because deep down, I don't believe I deserve consistent love," Aaliyah said, the words feeling foreign but true as she spoke them. "That growing up raising myself while caring for my grandmother taught me to be hyper-independent, which makes it hard to let people help even when I need it." They sat on a park bench while the babies had tummy time on a blanket spread across the grass, their conversation taking on the careful honesty of two people who'd learned that surface-level communication would never be enough for the family they were trying to build. "Dr. Rodriguez says that my abandonment trauma makes me hyper-vigilant about people's motives," Aaliyah continued. "I analyze everything for signs that someone is going to leave, which creates a self-fulfilling prophecy where my defensive behavior pushes people away. So we're both emotionally damaged people trying to raise emotionally healthy children, Xavier said with dark humor. That seems like a recipe for disaster. Or a recipe for growth, Aaliyah countered, watching their son grab his sister's hand as they lay side by side on the blanket. Maybe having to be better for them will force us to actually become better versions of ourselves. The conversation that followed was unlike anything they'd shared during their original relationship, when attraction and hope had masked the deeper work required for real intimacy. Now they talked about childhood wounds and learned behaviors, about the difference between romantic love and sustainable partnership, about what it would take to co-parent successfully, regardless of whether they ever rebuilt trust in each other romantically. When I admitted to Dr. Martinez that I was terrified you'd leave me like everyone else, so I left you first, she asked me something that broke me completely, Xavier said, his voice barely audible, as he watched their children explore grass with tiny fingers. What did she ask? She asked me what I would tell our children if they grew up believing that love meant hurting people before they could hurt you, Xavier replied, tears spilling down his cheeks despite his attempt to maintain composure. She asked me if I wanted to raise kids who were afraid to trust anyone, including their own parents. The question hit Aaliyah like a physical blow because she'd been asking herself the same thing. How do you teach children about healthy love when their parents couldn't model it? How do you break cycles of hurt that stretch back generations? What did you tell her? Aaliyah asked. That I want to be the father who shows them that love means staying, even when it's hard, Xavier said, his voice steady despite his tears. That I want them to see their parents work through problems instead of running from them. That I want to prove to them, and to you, that people can change when the stakes are high enough. When Xavier admitted his deepest fear about perpetuating cycles of abandonment, Aaliyah felt something shift in her chest, not forgiveness, which felt too big and complicated, but something smaller and more manageable. Understanding, maybe, or recognition that they were both fighting the same battle against patterns that had been years in the making. What if I told you that the scared boy who pushes people away isn't the man I fell for that night in Jacksonville? She said, the words coming from a place of honesty she hadn't accessed in months. Xavier's answer would test whether healing could lead to hope, whether two broken people could build something beautiful for the children who'd saved them both from their worst impulses. Then I'd ask you to help me figure out how to be that man every day, not just in moments when it's easy. As spring afternoon faded into evening and their babies dozed in their strollers, Aaliyah realized that maybe love wasn't about finding someone perfect. It was about finding someone committed to growing, someone willing to do the hard work of becoming worthy of the family they'd accidentally created in a moment of connection that had defied every odd against it. Watching him read bedtime stories to their twins, she realized the difference between the man who'd hurt her and the father who'd do anything for his children. Sunday afternoons at Piedmont Park had become their tradition, Xavier pushing the double stroller while Aaliyah carried the diaper bag, looking like any other family enjoying Atlanta's spring weather. At 18 months old, Xavier Jr. and Aaliyah Rose were walking, babbling, and getting into everything with the fearless curiosity that made every outing an adventure. Strangers assumed their parents were married, and sometimes, for brief moments, it felt natural to let them believe it. "Mama Duck!" Xavier Jr. pointed excitedly toward the pond where mallards paddled in lazy circles, his vocabulary expanding daily in ways that amazed both parents. "That's right, baby," Aaliyah said, lifting him from the stroller so he could see better. "Can you say, quack, quack?" "Cack, cack," he repeated with enthusiasm that made Xavier laugh as he lifted their daughter, who preferred observing to vocalizing but understood every word spoken around her. These family outings had evolved naturally from their co-parenting schedule, neither of them quite sure when your weekend with the twins had become our weekend together. Xavier had started staying for Sunday dinners at Aaliyah's apartment, helping with bath time and bedtime routines that stretched long into the evening. By the time both children were asleep, it felt strange for him to leave, but even stranger for him to stay. "Grandma Naomi wants to meet you," Aaliyah said as they settled on a park bench, while the twins explored the playground, with the careful supervision of parents who'd learned that 18-month-olds could find danger in a padded room. "She's coming to visit next month." The announcement carried weight beyond casual family introduction. Naomi Johnson had been Aaliyah's only family for most of her life, the woman who'd raised her granddaughter with love and limited resources while battling diabetes and arthritis. Her approval mattered in ways that no business deal or board meeting ever could. "What does she know about me?" Xavier asked, watching their son attempt to climb stairs designed for bigger children while their daughter studied other toddlers with scientific intensity. "Everything," Aaliyah replied honestly, "the good, the bad, and the complicated. She knows you hurt me, and she knows you've been trying to make it right. She knows our children light up when they see you, and she knows I'm struggling with what that means. When you see someone being an amazing parent to your children, does it change how you feel about them as a partner? Can good parenting heal relationship wounds, or are those separate things?" The questions had been following Aaliyah for months as she watched Xavier transform from the man who'd abandoned her into someone she barely recognized. "Papa, help!" Xavier Jr. called from the playground, his small arms reaching toward his father with complete confidence that help would come. Xavier was there instantly, lifting his son to the appropriate level while maintaining the kind of patient smile that suggested he'd rather be nowhere else. "I used to think love was about grand gestures," Aaliyah said, more to herself than to Xavier. "Expensive dinners, surprise trips, declarations that swept you off your feet. But watching you with them, I think maybe it's actually about showing up for the small moments." "Like 3 a.m. diaper changes and reading the same book 17 times in a row?" Xavier asked, settling back beside her with their son in his lap while their daughter climbed independently, "like remembering that our daughter needs her left sock put on before her right one, or that our son only eats blueberries if they're in the blue bowl," Aaliyah replied. "Like learning their individual personalities and loving them exactly as they are instead of trying to mold them into what you think they should be." The observation carried deeper meaning than child-rearing philosophy, and they both knew it. Xavier had spent months learning not just how to parent their children, but how to love them without trying to control or fix or improve them. The same patience he'd developed with 18-month-old tantrums had somehow extended to his interactions with their mother. "I've been thinking about something," Xavier said, as they walked back toward the parking area, their children now tired enough to cooperate with stroller restraints. "About what kind of family we want to be. Not co-parents sharing custody, but actual family." "What do you mean?" Aaliyah asked, though her heart already knew the direction of his thoughts. "I mean Sunday dinners and family vacations, and one house where we all live together," Xavier said, his voice carrying hope mixed with uncertainty. "I mean choosing each other every day, not just coordinating schedules for the sake of the children." The possibility hung between them like a bridge across 2 years of careful distance and protected hearts. Aaliyah had built a good life as a single mother, had learned to trust her own judgment and find joy in simple moments. Adding Xavier to that equation felt both natural and terrifying. "What about when things get hard?" she asked. "When the honeymoon phase of reunion wears off and we're just two imperfect people trying to build something real? What happens when your old patterns resurface, or mine do?" "Then we work through it," Xavier replied, with the confidence of someone who'd learned that love was a choice made repeatedly, not a feeling that sustained itself. "We go to therapy, we have hard conversations, we choose each other again. That's what commitment means. Not that we'll never struggle, but that we'll never stop trying." When their daughter took her first steps that evening, letting go of the coffee table in Aaliyah's living room and walking straight from her mother's arms into her father's, the moment felt complete in ways that had nothing to do with developmental milestones. "Dada," Aaliyah Rose said clearly, her first word perfectly timed as she reached Xavier's waiting hands. As they celebrated together, Xavier caught Aaliyah's hand and said, "Thank you for giving me the family I never thought I could have." The way he looked at her made it clear he wasn't just talking about the children. In his eyes, She saw recognition of everything she'd sacrificed to build this life, everything she'd forgiven to make their family possible, and everything she continued to give by allowing him into their daily routines. For the first time since that devastating morning in Jacksonville, Aaliyah found herself wondering if maybe, just maybe, she was ready to risk her heart on the man who'd proven that people really could change when the stakes were high enough. She'd spent 18 months learning to co-parent with him. Now she had to decide if she was brave enough to try loving him again. The roof deck of Aaliyah's new apartment in Virginia Highland offered views of Atlanta's skyline, but Xavier only watched her face as she considered his request for a real date. 2 years had changed them both. Parenthood had made them stronger, therapy had made them wiser, and time had made them ready for conversations that would have been impossible when their wounds were fresh. "You want to date me?" she said, not quite a question as she leaned against the railing with the city lights twinkling below. "After everything we've been through, you want to start over like we're strangers meeting for the first time?" "Not strangers," Xavier corrected, moving closer but respecting the careful distance she maintained even during their most honest moments. "But maybe like two people who've done the work to become worthy of what we lost the first time." The twins were asleep in their respective bedrooms, a routine they'd established during Xavier's extended visits that had gradually become overnight stays when late bedtimes made driving across town impractical. Neither of them had officially acknowledged that he was essentially living there 3 nights a week, but the extra clothes in her closet and his coffee maker on her counter told the story their words hadn't yet admitted. "I'm not the same woman who fell for you in Jacksonville," Aaliyah said, her voice carrying both warning and invitation. "I'm not naive about love anymore. I'm not going to sweep problems under the rug or ignore red flags because I want something to work out." "I'm counting on that," Xavier replied, his honesty cutting through any romantic pretense. "The woman I fell for was beautiful and kind, but she was also young and inexperienced and willing to accept crumbs because she didn't know she deserved a feast. This woman knows her worth. This woman built a life that works without me, which makes her choosing to include me mean something real." When someone has proven they've changed, is it possible to start fresh while honoring the lessons learned? What does healthy love look like after you've both grown through pain? The questions weren't theoretical anymore. They were decisions that would shape not just their future, but their children's understanding of what love could be. "I've been in therapy for 2 years, Aaliyah said, finally turning to face him fully. "I've learned things about myself that weren't pretty. I know I have trust issues and control issues and a tendency to catastrophize when things get uncertain. I know I push people away when I'm scared, and I analyze every gesture for signs of rejection. And I've learned that I sabotage relationships when they get real because I'm terrified of being vulnerable," Xavier replied. "I know I have a pattern of running when things get hard and using work as an excuse to avoid difficult emotions. I know I turn into someone cold and distant when I feel threatened." They stood on her roof deck listing their flaws like ingredients in a recipe for disaster, but somehow the honesty felt liberating instead of discouraging. This wasn't the fantasy version of love they'd tried to build before. This was two broken people choosing to risk their carefully rebuilt lives on the possibility that together they might be stronger than apart. "So what makes you think we could work this time?" Aaliyah asked. "Because now I know the difference between wanting someone and choosing them," Xavier said, reaching for her hands with the tentative touch of someone who'd learned not to take consent for granted. "Because I've seen you at your strongest and your most vulnerable, and I love both versions. Because we've already survived the worst of each other and somehow created the best thing either of us has ever been part of." When he kissed her on her apartment rooftop, city lights twinkling below, it felt different from their first time. Deeper, more intentional, weighted with 2 years of growth and understanding. There was no urgency born of fantasy, no desperate need to prove something to themselves or each other. Just the slow, careful exploration of two people who'd learned that real love required conscious choice rather than passionate impulse. "I know who you are now," she whispered against his lips, "and I know who I am. Let's see what we can build together." The movement to her bedroom was deliberate, marked by conversations between kisses about boundaries and expectations, about what this meant and where they wanted it to lead. The woman who'd once been swept away by grand gestures now insisted on conscious choice at every step. When they made love that night, it was with the reverence of people who'd almost lost everything and the passion of those who'd fought to earn it back. Xavier worshipped her body with new understanding of what a gift her trust represented, while Aaliyah allowed herself to be vulnerable in ways that 2 years of single motherhood had taught her to protect. "This is different," she breathed as he moved above her, their bodies finding rhythms that felt both familiar and completely new. "Better," Xavier agreed, his forehead resting against hers, as they moved together with the patience of people who finally understood that love wasn't a race to be won, but a foundation to be built slowly, carefully, with attention to every detail that would support the weight of a lifetime. Afterward, as they lay tangled in sheets that smelled like her independence and their shared future, neither heard the twins stirring in their cribs. But when their son's cry broke the spell, Xavier immediately moved to comfort him while Aaliyah tended their daughter. Working together in the dark, they realized this was what partnership actually looked like. Not romantic gestures or passionate declarations, but the unglamorous work of showing up for each other and their family, day after day, choice after choice. "No regrets?" Xavier asked as they settled back into bed with baby monitors glowing softly on the nightstand. "Only that it took us so long to trust what we built together," Aaliyah replied, pulling him closer to the life they were finally brave enough to claim. Some love stories begin with fairy tale romance and end with harsh reality, but the best ones start with truth, grow through adversity, and bloom into something stronger than either person could have created alone. 2 years after a one-night stand created miracle twins, they were finally building the family they'd both dreamed of, just not the way either had planned. Christmas morning in Xavier's renovated Atlanta home felt magical. Not because of the expensive decorations or designer tree that reached toward vaulted ceilings, but because 2-year-old twins squealed with delight while their parents watched from the couch, fingers intertwined, finally at peace with the complicated journey that had brought them here. "Mama, look!" Xavier Jr. held up a wooden truck with the enthusiasm of someone discovering buried treasure, while his sister methodically unwrapped each present, with the serious concentration she brought to everything. "That's beautiful, baby," Aaliyah said, marveling at how naturally domestic life had evolved since she'd moved into Xavier's Buckhead mansion 6 months earlier. The sterile showcase he'd called home had been transformed into something that actually felt like family lived there. Toys scattered across marble floors, finger paintings displayed prominently in the formal dining room, and the constant background noise of children's laughter replacing the echoing silence he'd lived with for years. "Papa, help me," Aaliyah Rose requested, struggling with tape on a package wrapped with more enthusiasm than skill. Xavier left his spot beside Aaliyah to kneel on the floor with his daughter, his patience endless when it came to anything involving their children. What does it mean to build a family the wrong way, but get the right result? Sometimes the most beautiful stories don't follow traditional timelines, meeting first, dating, marriage, then children. But watching Xavier help their daughter while their son brought each new toy to show his mother, Aaliyah realized that love didn't follow schedules or social expectations. "I have something for you," Xavier said as the children became absorbed in their new toys, producing a small wrapped box that made Aaliyah's heart skip despite her efforts to remain calm. "We said no gifts for each other," she protested, though she was already reaching for the package with curiosity that betrayed her practical words. "This isn't a Christmas gift," Xavier replied, his voice carrying a nervousness she hadn't heard since their early co-parenting days. "This is something else." Inside the box was a key, ornate, antique-looking, clearly meaningful rather than functional. Aaliyah held it up to catch the morning light streaming through windows that overlooked the garden where their children played every afternoon. "What does it unlock?" she asked. "Nothing," Xavier said, settling beside her on the couch that had become their favorite spot for late-night conversations after the twins were asleep. "It's a symbol. My therapist suggested it after I told her about my commitment issues, about how I always kept one foot out the door in case I needed to run." Aaliyah studied the key more carefully, noticing the engraving along its edge. Two tiny hearts, connected by an infinity symbol, with their children's initials intertwined. "I'm giving you the key to the door I always kept open," Xavier continued, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was offering. "I'm not going anywhere, Aaliyah. Not when things get hard, not when we disagree, not when life gets complicated. I'm here, completely here, for whatever comes next." The gesture was more intimate than any expensive jewelry, more meaningful than romantic gestures designed to impress rather than communicate. This was Xavier's way of saying that the man who'd once fled when relationships became real had chosen to stay and fight for what they'd built together. "I love you," she said, the words carrying weight they'd never held during their original relationship when love had been hope disguised as certainty. "I love the man you've become, the father you are to our children, the partner you choose to be every day." "I love you too," Xavier replied, pulling her closer as their children's happy chatter provided soundtrack to the most important conversation of their adult lives. "I love the strength you showed when I wasn't worthy of it, the grace you've given me while I learned to deserve your trust, the way you love our children even when loving me felt impossible." Their kiss was interrupted by small hands tugging on clothing and voices demanding attention from parents who were clearly not focusing properly on the important business of Christmas morning. But as they separated to help with toy assembly and snack distribution, both felt the deep satisfaction of people who'd chosen each other from a place of wisdom rather than need. "When do we tell them?" Aaliyah asked later that evening as they cleaned up wrapping paper and tried to find storage space for an impossible number of new toys. "When do we explain that Mama and Papa are choosing to be a family in all the ways that matter?" "When they're old enough to understand that some of the best things in life happen in the wrong order," Xavier replied, lifting their sleeping daughter from the couch where she dozed off surrounded by new stuffed animals. "When they can appreciate that their parents fought to become worthy of the miracle they created together." As they carried their children to bed and began the nighttime routine that had become as natural as breathing, neither could have imagined that their story was about to take another turn that would test everything they'd learned about love, commitment, and the courage required to build something lasting from the pieces of what had once been broken. When Xavier got down on one knee in front of the Christmas tree while their twins clapped and babbled, Aaliyah realized this wasn't about erasing the past. It was about choosing the future. "I'm not asking you to forget how we started," he said, holding a simple diamond ring that caught the light from their tree. "I'm asking if you'll help me write how we finish." The proposal she'd never expected was happening in front of the children who'd brought them together, in the home they'd created from nothing, with a man who'd learned that love wasn't about perfection. It was about showing up every day and choosing growth over comfort, commitment over convenience, and hope over fear. Her answer would determine whether their unconventional love story would have the ending they'd both learned to believe they deserved. The second proposal happened in front of their children, in the home they'd built together, with a man who'd learned that love isn't about perfection, it's about showing up every day and choosing growth. The ring caught morning light streaming through their Atlanta home as Xavier knelt beside the toy box where their twins played, making this proposal about the family they'd all built together. Unlike his first proposal years earlier in a Jacksonville penthouse designed to impress, this moment was about authenticity, about choosing each other from a place of wisdom rather than wishful thinking. "Aaliyah," Xavier said, his voice steady despite the enormity of what he was asking, "I'm not the same man who proposed to you the first time. I'm not offering you a fantasy or making promises I'm not sure I can keep." 2-year-old Xavier Jr. looked up from his blocks with curious eyes, while his sister continued arranging her toys with the methodical precision she'd inherited from both parents. They were witnesses to their father's most important moment, their presence making this proposal about more than romantic love. It was about the foundation of the family they'd accidentally created and consciously chosen to nurture. "What are you offering me?" Aaliyah asked, settling onto the floor beside him, with the natural grace of someone who'd learned that the most important conversations happened at children's eye level. "Partnership," Xavier replied, opening the ring box to reveal a solitaire diamond that was beautiful in its simplicity rather than its size. "I'm offering you a man who's learned that love is a daily choice, not a feeling that sustains itself. I'm offering you someone who's committed to growing with you instead of expecting you to fix his broken pieces." The ring itself was perfect in its meaning rather than its luxury, sized exactly right because he'd learned to pay attention to details that mattered, set in platinum because she'd mentioned once that gold made her skin look yellow, designed for daily wear by a woman who worked with her hands and didn't need jewelry to announce her worth. "I'm offering you a father for our children who will show up every day, not just when it's convenient or easy," Xavier continued, his words carrying the weight of 2 years spent proving that change was possible when the stakes were high enough. "I'm offering you a partner who's learned that vulnerability isn't weakness, it's the foundation of real intimacy." What makes a proposal meaningful, the surprise factor or the security of knowing it's right? When someone proves they've changed, how do you celebrate without forgetting the lessons learned? For Aaliyah, the answer lay in the careful attention Xavier had paid to every detail that mattered to her, rather than trying to impress her with things that didn't. "Mama, what Papa doing?" Xavier Jr. asked with the directness that made conversations with toddlers both challenging and refreshing. "Papa's asking Mama to marry him," Aaliyah replied, her voice catching slightly as the reality of the moment settled around them. "He's asking if we want to be a family in all the ways that matter." "We already family," their son stated with the logic of someone too young to understand legal distinctions, but old enough to recognize love when he saw it. "You're right, baby," Xavier said, lifting his son with one arm while keeping the ring box open with his free hand. "We're already a family. I'm just asking your mama if she wants to make it official." Their daughter abandoned her toys to climb into Aaliyah's lap, her serious eyes moving between her parents, as if she understood the importance of this conversation, even if she couldn't grasp its complexity. In her small arms, Aaliyah felt the weight of the decision she was making, not just for herself, but for the children who would grow up with whatever foundation their parents chose to build. "I'm scared," Aaliyah admitted, her honesty cutting through any romantic pretense. "I'm scared that marriage will change what we've built, that the pressure of forever will make us forget how hard we had to work to get here. I'm scared that we'll fall back into old patterns when life gets stressful." "I'm scared too," Xavier replied, his vulnerability making him more attractive than confidence ever could. "I'm scared I'll disappoint you again, that I'll let my fears override my commitment when things get hard. But I'm more scared of not trying, of letting fear keep us from becoming everything we could be together." When he slipped the ring onto her finger, it felt like coming home to a future they'd both learned to believe they deserved. The fit was perfect because he'd learned to pay attention to details that mattered. The design was timeless because he understood she valued substance over trends. And the moment was intimate because he'd finally learned that love wasn't about performing for an audience. It was about showing up authentically for the people who mattered most. "Yes," she said, the word carrying 2 years of growth, forgiveness, and conscious choice. "Yes, I'll marry you. Not because I need you to complete me, but because I want to build something beautiful with the man you've chosen to become." They made love that night with the passion of people celebrating a future they'd fought to create, and the tenderness of those who understood how precious second chances really were. Xavier worshipped her body with new understanding of what a gift her trust represented, while Aaliyah allowed herself to be completely vulnerable with someone who'd proven worthy of everything she had to give. "No regrets?" he asked, as he slowly removed the simple dress she'd worn to their family proposal, his hands reverent on fabric that would become another memory in their unconventional love story. "Only that it took us so long to trust what we built together," she breathed, pulling him into the life they'd finally decided to claim completely. As they celebrated their engagement in the bedroom of the home they'd created for their miracle children, both understood that this marriage wouldn't be about fairy tale endings. It would be about the daily choice to love each other through whatever challenges lay ahead, to grow together instead of apart, and to honor the pain that had taught them to value real love over fantasy romance. Some proposals happen in restaurants with hidden cameras and orchestrated surprises, but the most meaningful ones happen in living rooms with toys scattered around, with children as witnesses, with partners who've learned that the best love stories aren't about perfection. They're about people brave enough to choose each other, flaws and all, and commit to becoming better together than they ever could alone. 3 years after a one-night stand that created miracle twins, they married in the Jacksonville hospital where they first met, proving that some love stories begin with endings and end with beginnings. The hospital chapel at Jacksonville General overlooked the children's wing that Xavier's foundation had built, its floor-to-ceiling windows offering views of the garden where young patients found healing in sunshine and flowers. Aaliyah stood in the bridal suite that had been donated by grateful families, adjusting her simple white dress while her 3-year-old daughter served as the world's most serious flower girl. "Mama pretty," Aaliyah Rose announced with the gravity of someone making an important observation, her own white dress a miniature version of her mother's elegant but understated gown. "Thank you, baby," Aaliyah replied, kneeling to adjust her daughter's flower crown while their son practiced walking slowly with the ring pillow he'd insisted on carrying, despite being barely tall enough to see over it. This wedding was everything their first attempt hadn't been: intimate instead of extravagant, meaningful instead of performative, focused on the people who mattered rather than those they wanted to impress. 40 guests filled the chapel's wooden pews, a carefully chosen group of family and friends who'd witnessed their journey from breakdown to breakthrough. Miss Rosa sat in the front row beside Grandmother Naomi, both women dabbing their eyes with tissues as they watched the family they'd helped nurture finally claim the happiness they'd fought so hard to deserve. Dr. Patel occupied a seat of honor with the medical staff who'd delivered the twins during Hurricane Helen, their presence a reminder that some miracles required community effort to survive and thrive. "Are you ready?" asked Dr. Martinez, who'd agreed to officiate their ceremony after walking beside them through 2 years of individual and couples therapy. "Ready to promise each other what you've already been living?" The question carried deeper meaning than traditional wedding ceremonies typically acknowledged. Xavier and Aaliyah weren't promising to love each other. They'd already proven that through the hardest tests life could offer. They weren't vowing to stay together through better or worse. They'd already survived the worst and built something beautiful from its ashes. Today, they were simply making public what had been true in private for months: that 2 broken people had chosen to heal together, that miracle babies had taught their parents how to believe in the impossible, and that the most beautiful families weren't always created in traditional ways. "Dearly beloved," Dr. Martinez began, her voice carrying across the small chapel with warm authority, "we gather today not to witness the beginning of this family, but to celebrate its continued growth. Xavier and Aaliyah have already learned the hardest lessons of partnership, that love is a choice made daily, that trust must be earned through consistent action, and that the most beautiful relationships are built by people brave enough to be authentic rather than perfect." Xavier stood at the altar in a navy suit that emphasized his eyes, holding their son's hand, while their daughter stood beside her mother with flowers clutched in small fists. The image would later become their favorite wedding photo, not formal poses arranged by photographers, but a candid moment that captured the genuine joy of a family finally at peace with their unconventional story. "Xavier," Dr. Martinez continued, "your vows." "Aaliyah," Xavier said, his voice steady as he faced the woman who taught him that vulnerability was strength and that real love required courage rather than perfection. "3 years ago, I gave you my body, but not my heart. Today, I'm giving you everything I have, my fears, my hopes, my commitment to growing into the man our children deserve as a father and you deserve as a partner." His words carried the weight of therapy sessions and hard conversations, of nights spent working through triggers and patterns that had once seemed impossible to break. I promise to choose us every day, especially when it's hard. I promise to stay and fight for what we've built instead of running when things get complicated. I promise to love you, not because you complete me, but because you inspire me to complete myself. When Aaliyah spoke her vows, her voice carried the strength of someone who'd learned to trust her own judgment while remaining open to love. Xavier, you gave me our children before you gave me your heart. But that taught me something beautiful. That love isn't just about what we feel, but about what we choose to build together, one day at a time. The ceremony lasted 30 minutes, but every word carried the weight of lived experience rather than hopeful promises. When Dr. Martinez pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared tasted like forgiveness and hope, and the kind of love that could only exist after illusions died and truth took their place. The reception was potluck in the hospital's family room, decorated with flowers from Miss Rosa's garden and photos documenting their journey from that first devastating morning to this moment of conscious commitment. Medical staff mingled with family members, sharing stories about the couple who'd found their way back to each other through the miracle children who'd brought love into focus for two people who'd almost given up on it entirely. So what would you do if someone who'd hurt you came back genuinely changed and proved it through years of consistent action? Aaliyah asked during her toast to the assembled crowd. Would you take the risk? Would you believe that people can really transform? We're here tonight because sometimes the answer is yes, but only when both people do the work to become worthy of that yes. That evening, Xavier carried his bride over the threshold of the same Jacksonville penthouse where they'd first made love, but everything felt different, deeper, earned, real. The space had been redecorated to reflect the family they'd become, rather than the fantasy they'd once tried to create. "Thank you for teaching me that miracles aren't just medical," he whispered as he slowly removed her simple wedding dress, his hands reverent on skin that had carried their children and survived his abandonment and chosen to trust him again. They're what happens when two broken people choose to heal together. Their wedding night was passionate but unhurried, marked by the deep intimacy of people who'd seen each other at their worst and chosen each other at their best. No grand gestures or expensive lingerie, just two people celebrating a love that had survived its own destruction and emerged transformed. "In 5 years," Aaliyah whispered as they lay tangled in sheets that smelled like their shared future, "when people ask about our love story, what will we tell them?" "The truth," Xavier replied, his arms tightening around the woman who'd taught him that real love was built on honesty rather than hope. That sometimes you have to lose everything to find what actually matters. That miracle babies don't just defy medical odds. They teach their parents that the impossible becomes possible when you're brave enough to believe in second chances. If this story of miracle babies and second chances touched your heart, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear that the most beautiful families aren't always created the traditional way. Tell me in the comments, do you believe in medical miracles? Do you believe people can truly change? And remember, sometimes our greatest mistakes lead to our greatest blessings, and the most meaningful love stories are written by people brave enough to choose growth over perfection, again and again. This is Mr. Daniel, and this has been your story of miracle twins and the parents who learned that love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone committed to becoming worthy of the family you build together. Until next time, keep believing in the magic of second chances and the miracles that happen when broken people choose to heal together.